Devonshire, September 1818. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which was not significant in itself. What was significant was the seal, pressed with the deliberate weight of a man who had never once questioned whether his correspondence would be received. The Ashvane crest, a stag above a bridge, a Latin motto so old the family had apparently forgotten what it meant, though they continued embossing it on everything they owned, which was a fairly precise summary of the Ashvane approach to most things. Alawan Sara set the letter down on the writing desk without opening it. She had spent 4 years managing her late father's textile concerns and had learned to read the weight of a thing before committing to its contents. Then she picked it up and broke the seal cleanly, the way she did everything, without ceremony, without delay, without leaving marks. The letter was from Edmund Ashvane, the Duke of Ashvane, and it read like a man doing her a considerable favor by writing it all. 3 paragraphs. The first established that the Duke required a wife. The second established that Alawan Sara, daughter of the late Calthorpe Sara of the textile interests, possessed what he required: sufficient capital, adequate social competence, and, the word had been selected with a care she clocked immediately, appropriate discretion. The third proposed a meeting. Harrowfield, his principal Devonshire estate. Tuesday, 10 o'clock. No question mark anywhere in the 3 paragraphs. She noticed this. She was 28. She had her father's eye for numbers and her mother's talent for making a room feel precisely as important as it needed to be. No more, no less. She had been proposed to 3 times since her father's passing. Twice by men who wanted the sorry accounts, once by a man who had genuinely wanted her, which she had found moving and impossible in equal measure. She was not against marriage in principle. She was against marriage as a transaction in which she was the lesser party. She read the Duke's letter a second time, the word appropriate before discretion. No reference to her as a person, as distinct from her as a financial instrument. 6 days' notice of a meeting he appeared to consider already arranged. Then she wrote back. 1 draft. She was not a woman who required 2. She would attend Tuesday at 10. She looked forward, she wrote, to a frank discussion. She signed it E. Sar, sealed it with plain dark wax. Business correspondence, because that was what this was, and handed it to Mrs. Pell, her housekeeper, who appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had read the room from the hallway and formed her opinion without requiring the details. Alawan returned to the window, and the river Calde, moving through the lower valley, with the indifference of water that has been doing this for centuries. She turned the word appropriate over in her mind, and what it meant when a duke placed it before discretion and believed that constituted a compliment. She was not, she decided, going to be appropriate, but she was going to be on time. Harrowfield was everything its letter had promised, and nothing more, imposing from the drive, slightly confused on closer acquaintance, full of rooms that existed because there had always been rooms there, rather than because anyone had needed them. The park was well kept. The formal garden to the east was precisely maintained. The stables, visible beyond the east corner, were in excellent repair. Alawan noted all of it, not for judgment, but for accuracy. 2 upper windows on the west wing had been reglazed recently. The stonework on the south face needed pointing. Men preserved what they loved and economized on everything else. The stables had not been economized on. She was shown into a receiving room furnished correctly 30 years ago and not revisited since. Portraits lined the walls. The Ashvane succession, the same jaw repeated across generations, the expression of people who had never needed to revise a position and had found this a virtue. She stood near the window and waited, because how you waited was the first thing people read about you. He kept her waiting 9 minutes. She counted them, not from impatience, but because she wanted the number. Edmund Ashvane, the Duke of Ashvane, was 41 years old, well made in the manner of men who had always eaten well and moved through the world assuming physical space was arranged for their comfort. He had the Ashvan jaw and the Ashvan expression, not arrogance precisely, but the settled certainty of a man who had decided long ago what the world contained and had not been seriously revised since. The silence when he entered ran slightly longer than the social register required. He was accustomed to women who filled it, she understood, and was recalibrating in a way he was not aware of. He was direct. He required a wife. The estate was sound, said with the reflexive confidence of a man who had not personally reviewed the accounts in some time. He needed a woman who could manage a household of Harrowfield's scope and be received well in county society. His expression shifted in a way that was controlled, but not quite controlled enough. He needed, he said, a woman who understood that certain. He chose the next word, with the care of a man selecting between honesty and strategy. Certain prior claims on his attention would remain. Prior claims, Allowance said. Not a question. A repetition, which was different. It put the words back in the room where he had to see them. There is a woman, he said. She has been part of my life for some years. She will continue to be. A wife would need to understand this. A pause that had made its decision. She comes first. I want that understood before anything else is discussed. The room was very quiet. The garden beyond the window continued its precise maintenance, indifferent to what was occurring inside. Elowen looked at the Duke across the careful space of the receiving room. She looked at the set of his jaw, the same jaw as the portraits, but arranged differently now, bracing rather than asserting. His hands were still, which told her he had decided this and was not going to be moved. She considered what it meant to be invited to discuss a marriage, and informed, at the outset, that she would occupy its secondary position. She weighed the reglazed windows against the impeccable stables. She measured the architecture of sentences built to contain things they were not quite ready to name. Then she smiled, not a social smile, not warm, not stiff, not any of the varieties she had deployed in drawing rooms and boardrooms over the years. The smile of a woman who has received, in the place of an insult, a piece of intelligence she intends to use. Then, said Elowen Sara, she may settle your debts. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one before. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Not quite. Something more unsettled than anger. Because anger would have been familiar. This was the expression of a man who had prepared for several possible responses and had not prepared for this one. I beg your pardon, he said. 4 words of time. Your estate, she said, with the clarity of a woman who would not repeat herself, but would, as a courtesy, be more specific. The west wing has new glazing, where the old frames were failing. The south face is 2 seasons past pointing. The grounds are maintained because groundskeeping is the last thing a family reduces. It is the first thing a visitor sees. She held his gaze. The stables are perfect, which confirms it. If the woman who comes first is able to settle the obligations that require settling, I congratulate you both. If she is not, then the conversation you require is not about prior claims. It is about liquidity. And that, she said, is a conversation I am entirely qualified to have, when you are ready to have it honestly. She did not wait to see what his face did next. She walked to the door with the composed efficiency of a woman who had concluded her business and was in the carriage and back through the Harrowfield gates before the steward had finished wondering what had occurred. Her companion, Miss Orla Teft, 11 years her closest friend, whatever the formal arrangement was called, said nothing until they were well clear of the Harrowfield drive. He told you a woman comes before you, Orla said, and you told him she could pay his bills. If she comes first, she may come first in all respects. It was accurate. Orla let the road pass. "What will you do?" she said eventually, which was what she always said, which was the right question. Alain looked at the countryside and considered the Ashvine estate with its two faces. The one it showed from the drive, all authority and permanence, and the one she had read in 9 minutes of waiting, the face of a house borrowing against its own grandeur and running short of collateral. A man who had not once asked her a single question about herself. "The Ashvane estate has a mill," she said, "on the River Holne, 3 miles north of Harrowfield, converted for wool processing 15 years ago, running below capacity since the trade routes shifted after the conflict with France. The machinery is sound, but the contracts are not. My father's firm had dealings with the Ashvine mill agent 4 years ago." She paused. "It could be profitable. It simply requires someone who understands the current market." Orla looked at her. "You have been thinking about the Ashvane mill. I have been thinking about the Devonshire wool market. The mill is adjacent to that consideration. The mill is on Ashvane land. It is on Ashvine land, which borders the Holne Valley, which borders the Creswick parcels currently in receivership. The Creswick parcels include water rights on the eastern tributary that would considerably improve the mill's intake capacity." She looked at the road ahead. "I have been in correspondence with the receiver's office since June." Orla was quiet for a moment, that had the quality of a silence doing a great deal of internal work. "You are going to buy land that borders the Ashvane estate." "I'm going to acquire a sound commercial asset in the Holne Valley." "It is purely a commercial decision." Orla looked at her with 11 years of close attention and was in no doubt about which category this fell into. She returned to her novel and did not read it. The Creswick parcels were acquired by the end of October, faster than most Devonshire property transactions, because Eloan had the Sare solicitors, the Sare accounts, and the particular velocity of a woman who has decided something and finds delay an insult to the decision. The purchase included 14 acres, water rights on the eastern Holne tributary, and a disused fulling mill building with its original wheel housing intact. Sound by any measure. Adjacent, as Orla had noted. The Duke learned of his new neighbor through county channels. He received the news with an expression that gave nothing away, and looked at the north window toward the Holne Valley. "The mill agent. When does his contract term end?" "January," his steward told him. "Have the books reviewed before December." The estate review continued. He returned his gaze to the north window twice more before it was done. Alain arrived at the parcel in the 2nd week of November with her estate manager, a surveyor, and Mrs. Pell, who had declared without being asked that she intended to see it herself. She spent the first 2 days walking every acre methodically. The drainage was poor along the northern edge. The fulling mill building was structurally sound, the wheel housing nearly 200 years old, and in better condition than anything built in the last 30 had any right to be. On the 3rd morning, she rode out to look at the water rights. The eastern tributary ran clear and cold along the northern boundary, 8 feet across at this point, more come March. Beyond it, Ashvine mill land, the mill itself visible in the distance, the wheel not turning. Which confirmed what the market figures had already told her. She heard the horse before she saw it. It came from the Ashvane side, at a pace that said it had come deliberately. Edmund Ashvine pulled up on the opposite bank and looked at her across the water with an expression she recognized from the receiving room, except that something in it had moved, was still moving. "Miss Sare," he said. "Your Grace." She did not step back from the bank. He looked at the tributary, then at the old fulling mill behind her, then back. "You have been busy." The parcel was reasonably priced. The water rights were in the Creswick deed of 1803. I had the original documents reviewed before making the offer. She held his gaze. I was thorough. "The eastern tributary feeds the Ashvane Mill intake," he said. "It does," she said. "At present." He was still for a moment in the November cold. Then, "I received your message, Miss Sari, in September." He stopped, looked at the water, looked back at her, that expression still moving, still not arrived. I did not answer it well. She said nothing. Silence, correctly deployed, was the most efficient response to an incomplete sentence. He did not finish it. He turned the horse and went back toward the Ashvane Mill without another word. She stood at the bank after he had gone and turned the phrase over. I did not answer it well. What a man who had answered everything to his own satisfaction his entire life meant when he said something like that. She noticed the expression that had not yet arrived, and the sentence he had not completed, and the January date she already knew by heart. Then she turned and walked back to the SAR parcel and did not think about any of it for the rest of the day, with considerably less success than she would have preferred. The county of Devonshire had been watching. Devonshire was old enough to have opinions, prosperous enough to discuss them, and connected enough that a SARE acquisition in the Holne Valley, sharing a water boundary with the Ashvane Mill, whose meeting with Miss Sare had concluded with speed and no announcement, was county knowledge before the ink on the deed had dried. The county drew conclusions. The county was not entirely wrong. Elowin was received through the winter months with the warmth Devonshire extended to a woman who had money, competence, and the good sense not to make either of them anyone else's problem. She attended the dinners worth attending, in a proportion that told the county she intended to remain. She was introduced to Mrs. Halvard Pine, a widow of 55, sharper intelligence than her social manner suggested, 12 years managing her late husband's affairs, who recognized in Elowin within 10 minutes someone doing the same. At the second dinner of December, a formal occasion at the Pines house in Holnecroft, 12 people, the good silver, she was in the same room as the Duke for the first time since the water's edge. He arrived after her, was seated at the opposite end of the table, and did not look at her. Not because he was unaware of her, but because he had decided not to, which was a decision, and decisions were information. He looked once, during the second course, when she had turned to speak with young Mr. Pine about Florence. She did not turn. She felt the quality of the room change in the way it changed when someone's attention shifted towards you with more than social interest. She noted it without acknowledging it, the way she noted a change in the accounts without reacting until she understood what had changed and why. After dinner, while the men were still at table, Mrs. Halvard Pine appeared at Elowin's side. "He mentioned your acquisition, Mrs." Pine said. "In October, at the Drell gathering. Twice. Which is once more than Edmund Ashvine mentions anything he finds merely incidental." She looked at Elowin with the direct attention of someone who has earned the right to be direct. "I am not his advocate. I have been his neighbor for 20 years and his friend for 15. And I will tell you what I know, because I believe you are a woman who uses information correctly." She paused. The woman he spoke of. Her name is Mrs. Rosalind Fenny. She was a close acquaintance of his late mother, and has been a presence at Harrowfield since he was 19. She is 53, widowed twice. She is not, Mrs. Pine said, what you were likely imagining. The drawing room was quiet around them. "No," Elowin said after a moment. "She is not." He has been loyal to her in the way of men who learn loyalty early and apply it past the point of reason. Mrs. Fenny is not in a position to settle anything. She is in a position to be settled. An arrangement quietly maintained by the Ashvane estate for years, at a cost it can no longer easily absorb. She set her cup down. "I'm telling you this because the conversation you had in September was the first conversation anyone has had with him in 4 years. that named the actual problem instead of accommodating it. Alawan was quiet. She turned over the receiving room, the word appropriate. A man who had walked in with a policy he had held so long he had stopped examining its foundations. She had thought it was arrogance. It was something older than arrogance, considerably harder to revise. She turned over the expression at the water's edge, still moving, not yet arrived. The sentence he had not completed. The men came through from the dining room. Across the drawing room, the Duke met her eyes for exactly 1 beat longer than the occasion required. Then he looked away. Not because he was done, she understood. Because he wasn't yet ready to begin. She turned back to Mrs. Pine. "Thank you," she said. It was the most she intended to say about it. And Mrs. Halvard Pine, who was a woman of considerable intelligence, received it as exactly what it was. January arrived with the blunt cold of a season that has run out of patience for anything decorative. The mill agent's contract expired on the 14th. Eloan knew the date because she had noted it in October and had not forgotten it, the way she did not forget any date sitting at the intersection of practical consequence and something she was not yet ready to name. On the 15th, she received a letter, 1 paragraph, not 3. "The mill agent's contract has lapsed. I intend to review the supply arrangements before appointing a successor. The Eastern Tributary access is a matter I would prefer to discuss directly rather than through agents. If you are willing, I propose a meeting at the mill itself. Your convenience, your time." Signed E. Ashvine, not the signature of formal correspondence, the signature of a man who had written it himself. She noted that he had offered her the choice of time, and that he had considered how it would look to the county, and provided her cover without her having to ask. She wrote back in 1 draft. The following Thursday at 11, neither urgent nor delayed, which was where she chose to be. Thursday was cold and clear in the Devonshire January way. Frost gone by 10, the air sharper than it looked. She arrived at the mill with Goss, solid and unemotional. A man who understood his function was to be useful rather than impressive. She had brought him because the meeting needed to be correctly categorized, and because she had stopped arranging herself for anyone's benefit. The Duke was already there. On foot. In a coat that was good quality, and worn with the indifference of a man who had not thought about it this morning. He had brought no one, which told her something about how he had categorized the meeting that was different from how she had. He looked at Goss, recalibrated, and said, "Miss Sare, Your Grace, this is Goss, my estate manager. He knows the water rights documentation better than I do, which makes him useful." Something moved in the Duke's expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the space where one might eventually be. "Then he is welcome," he said, and opened the mill door. The mill was cold with the particular cold of stone that has not been heated in days, smelling of wool dust and damp and river-fed machinery. A good building, proportions right, ceiling high enough, the floor worn smooth by decades of work in the pattern that showed you exactly how that work had moved through the space. Alawan walked the length of it with the same attention she had brought to the land in November. He walked beside her. He did not speak first. At Harrowfield in September, he had spoken immediately, with the forward momentum of a man who assumed the direction of a conversation was his to set. Today he was walking at her pace, letting the building speak before he did. "The machinery has been maintained correctly," she said. "The machinery has not been the problem," he said. "The trade route disruption after the French conflict took 3 years longer to correct than my father's agent predicted. By the time it corrected, our competitors had renegotiated their supply arrangements, and we were working from a disadvantage we have not recovered." She had known this in outline. Hearing him say it directly was different. The difference between reading a balance sheet and watching a man read it aloud. The numbers were the same, but the reading revealed whether the man understood what he was looking at. He understood. "I am willing to discuss a channel modification agreement," she said. "One that formalizes my water rights, provides the mill with improved intake capacity, and establishes a framework for coordinated management of the shared waterway." Goss, with the trained discretion of a good estate manager, was studying a section of machinery at the far end of the building with enormous interest. "You would benefit from this as well," the Duke said, "which is the only kind of arrangement I enter." He looked at her in the way she had seen him look at things when he was actually paying attention rather than assessing. Slower, more open, without the managed distance of the receiving room. "My father's solicitors have managed the Ashvane affairs for 30 years and have not once suggested a solution to the intake problem. They manage what they are given. They do not typically look at a water boundary and ask who owns the other side of it and what she might want." He was still, with the stillness of a man processing carefully. What does she want? It was the first question he had ever asked her. In September, he had not asked her anything. At the water's edge, he had spoken and recalculated and left. Today, he was standing in his own mill in January, asking what she wanted. Not the posture of the man from the receiving room. The posture of someone beginning to understand that he had been failing to ask it for some time. Elowen looked at him across the worn stone floor, the river moving beyond the wall with its permanent, indifferent authority. She considered what she wanted, which was several things, and which of them she was ready to name. "A fair agreement on the water rights," she said. "Documented correctly, with both parties' interests reflected." She held his gaze. "To begin with." The last 3 words landed in the cold air and stayed there. He did not look away. She did not look away. The river moved. "To begin with," he said quietly, the way a man repeated something he intended to remember. Goss reappeared at the correct moment. They spent the next hour reviewing the survey together, the 3 of them over the rolled document on the mill table, moving between the diagrams and the machinery and the north-facing window. The Duke asked 2 questions that confirmed he understood the mechanics, and one that told her he had been thinking about the solution before today. At the end of the hour, when Goss had gone to bring the carriage round, the Duke stood at the mill door, looking at the January landscape, the Holne Valley running silver and bare, the tributary just visible through the willows, and said, without looking at her, "I owe you a more complete answer than the one I gave you in September." She waited. She had become good at waiting in his company. "Not today," he said. He turned to look at her, the expression further along than it had been at the water's edge. "But I owe you one. I want you to know that I know it." She considered the answer he had not given, and whether she was ready for it when he did. She was not. She would be. The difference between the two was smaller than it had been in November. "Thursday was useful," she said. "We should continue the survey next week, if the weather holds." "Yes," he said. "We should." He held the mill door. She walked out into the January cold, and the river moved in the willows, and the sky was the clear pale blue of a morning that has decided to be honest about what it is. The first county assembly of the season was at Holnecroft Hall, because Mrs. Halvard Pine had hosted the first assembly every February for 14 years. 51 people. Elowen attended with Orla, who had spent the carriage journey asking questions about the mill meeting that Elowen had answered with a selectivity Orla found instructive. She arrived in her better dark blue, serious without trying, because she was not trying. She lived here now. The Duke was across the room when she arrived, in conversation near the south windows. He was not looking at her. She was not looking at him. Both statements were technically true. She talked with Mr. Pine about the wool market and found his opinions were not derivative of his father's. She was still talking with him when the Duke appeared, said something about the Holnecroft drainage program that turned Mr. Pine toward Sir Cavan across the room, and then there were 2 of them, where there had been 3, and neither had arranged it. The survey, he said. Goss and my mill manager completed the second section on Wednesday. Results are consistent with what we discussed. The intake modification is more straightforward than I initially estimated. 2 weeks of work, correctly scheduled. 3, he said, if we do it correctly and do not cut the cofferdam short. He said it as a man offers a position he is prepared to defend, not the Duke of Ashvane from the receiving room, who would have decided and announced. 3, she said, if the weather turns in February, which in Devonshire is not a small if. Agreed. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging since November and had not yet finished cataloging. I have been in correspondence with a Bristol wool merchant, a man named Tolchard. Your father worked with him. She was still for a moment. Tolchard and Sons was a firm she knew precisely. Her father had held a long arrangement with them, renegotiated twice to the Sare firm's advantage. How did you come to be in correspondence with them? I wrote to them in December, after reviewing the Sare firm's historical contracts with the Ashvane mill agent, the ones your father negotiated directly 8 years ago. He achieved terms the mill agent had said were not available. They were available. He simply knew how to ask for them. A pause. I wanted to understand how. She looked at him. Her father had written those contracts late in the evenings and had let her sit across from him while he worked, because he had decided when she was 12 that her presence there was a necessity rather than a kindness. Here was a man who had gone looking for a contract her father wrote 8 years ago because he wanted to understand how. She was formulating what to say next when the room shifted, the particular reorientation of 50 people noticing the same thing simultaneously. Lord Carwick had arrived. A Viscount of 58, his family in Devonshire since before anyone living could remember. The unexamined confidence of a man whose positions had never been seriously challenged, and who therefore did not know what challenge looked like. He arrived at Alohan's left side with the timing of a man who had chosen his moment. 6 people within easy hearing. Miss Sare, I am told you have taken on the Creswick land. I have acquired the parcel, yes. Ambitious, he said. In another mouth, neutral. In his, with his timing and his witnesses, it meant merchant's money, old county, overreached. He continued with something about established order and the character of the county. She held his gaze with the composure of a woman who had heard this variety of condescension in many rooms and understood precisely how it worked. She was deciding on her next sentence when she heard the Duke's voice. The Sare acquisition, he said, from her right, in the voice beneath all his other voices, the one with 200 years of Devonshire in it, includes water rights that will allow a channel modification the Ashvane mill has required for a decade. The investment is entirely proportionate. The Holne Valley benefits from landowners who understand what they have acquired. I believe we are agreed on that. He held the look at Lord Carwick for 1 moment longer than necessary. Lord Carwick's smile recalibrated rapidly. Of course, he said. Quite right. He moved on. Alohan stood beside the Duke in the aftermath. He was talking about the road bill, nothing in his manner suggesting he had just done something significant. But he knew he had. She could see it in his stillness. A man who has acted deliberately and is waiting, without appearing to see what comes of it. She turned to him. You named the mill. The mill is relevant. You could have said nothing. Lord Carwick was performing, not arguing. I am aware of what he was doing. I am also aware of what I didn't do in September, which I am not going to repeat. The room continued around them. A footman moved through with a tray. The ordinary machinery of a February evening, indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted, irrevocably, between 2 people standing near the south wall. You mentioned a more complete answer, she said. The one you owe me. He looked at her, the expression further along than it had been at the mill, the distance no longer being managed. "Come to Harrowfield on Friday, not the receiving room, the study. There is a conversation we should have where the furniture was not arranged for it." She considered the receiving room, with its arranged chairs and 3 paragraphs. A study, a room where a person actually worked, where the books on the shelves would tell her something true. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he said. He returned to the road bill. She returned to Orla, who had been watching from across the room and had formed a comprehensive opinion she was going to exercise considerable restraint about for now. The evening drew toward its close with the unhurried satisfaction of a county that had noticed something and was deciding what to make of it. Friday came with the kind of Devonshire morning that felt like a decision, sharp and dry and full of light, that had no interest in being ambiguous. Elowen rode to Harrowfield alone, without Goss, without Orla. This was not a meeting about the mill. She was shown not to the receiving room, but to a room at the back of the house facing the Holme Valley. A working room, a large oak desk covered in the organized disorder of a man who worked here every day. Ledgers, correspondence, estate maps with their corners worn from use. The bookshelves were full, the spines broken in, the books arranged not alphabetically or decoratively, but by subject and use. The order in which a man reached for things when he was thinking. No portraits in this room. Above the fireplace, one landscape, the Holme Valley in summer, the river in the middle distance. Chosen because the person who hung it wanted to look at it. He was at the desk and rose when she came in. Not the performance of the receiving room, simply a man getting up because a person had arrived. "This is where you actually work," she said. "The other rooms are for the county. This one is for the estate." He gestured to the chair across the desk with the directness of a man who had decided not to perform this meeting. He did not begin with the mill. He began with Mrs. Rosalind Fenny, which told her that Mrs. Pine had been correct about what this conversation required. "I should have explained in September," he said. "Instead, I stated a condition and expected it to be accommodated." He looked at the desk. He had the quality, she had come to recognize, of a man who found inaccuracy in his own speech more uncomfortable than silence. It was the approach of a man who had been accommodated too long and had mistaken accommodation for agreement. She waited. This was the most honest thing he had said to her, and she was not going to interrupt it. Rosalind Fenny was my mother's closest friend. When my mother passed, I was 22. Mrs. Fenny remained. She had nowhere else of consequence to go, and I had no one else who had known my mother, and the arrangement became permanent in the way of things that are never formally decided. He looked at the landscape above the fireplace. "She is not a claim on my affections. She is a responsibility I have held for 19 years, which is a different thing entirely, though I did not have the clarity to distinguish between them when I spoke to you in September, or the honesty." Elowen looked at him. The study, the maps, the worn, spined books, the landscape chosen because he wanted to look at it. A man of 22 who had lost his mother and held on to the last person who had known her for 19 years, without once asking what it was costing or whether there was another way to carry it. A grief dressed as loyalty. Not so different in its architecture from what Mrs. Pine had described. She understood what it meant to name it, finally, in this room, to a woman he had dismissed in September and had been revising ever since. "You have been working on this since November," she said. "Since the water's edge," he said. "Since you said to begin with and meant it, and I understood what you meant." He met her eyes steadily across the desk with its months of quiet work between them. "Miss Sar, Elowen, will you?" She held up one hand, not to stop him, to slow him. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me when the channel modification is complete, and the toll-chart contract is signed, and Mrs. Fenny is settled by an arrangement that has nothing to do with whether I say yes. Ask me when the answer does not carry the weight of the problem. Ask me when it is only about the question." He held her gaze for a long moment. The fire moved. The valley held its February light. "How long?" he said. "April," she said. "April is sufficient." He nodded, the nod of a man who has been given a fair condition and recognized it as fair. "April," he said. She rose. She looked at the room one last time. The desk, the maps, the broken spines, the landscape he had chosen because he wanted to look at it, and understood what it meant to be shown the room where a person actually lived rather than the room where they received the world. She rode back to the SAR parcel in the February cold and turned over April, and the question he had not finished asking, and whether she had been right to slow him down. She had been. It had cost her something to do it. Both conclusions were true simultaneously, which was, she had found, the condition of most things that mattered. The channel modification at the mill began in the second week of March. The Duke had engaged his mill manager and 2 workers who knew the Holmes' behavior in the spring melt. Ilawan had engaged the surveyor and Goss. They worked from both sides of the tributary simultaneously, the efficient approach and the approach of 2 people who had decided something without having said it and were conducting themselves accordingly. She was at the channel site on the 3rd morning when he arrived on foot from the Ashvine side, in the practical coat she had catalogued since January. He stood at the edge of the works and looked at the progress with the attention of a man who had been thinking about this problem long enough to have an informed opinion. "The East Cofferdam is holding," he said. "Better than I expected. Goss doubled the staking on Tuesday. The melt is running faster than the survey projected. 3 weeks, he said. And there was something in it that was not entirely about the Cofferdam. 3 weeks, she agreed, and something in that which was not either. They walked the length of the channel together afterward, and the conversation moved the way it had begun to move, from the practical to the adjacent, and from the adjacent to things that were not practical at all, in the way of 2 people who have stopped pretending they are only talking about the thing they are officially talking about. He told her about the summer. The river flooded the mill floor 2 feet deep when he was 12, and his father had stood on the wheel housing to redirect the flow and lost his footing, and the mill workers helped him to the bank, and his father sat laughing until he could not stop. She told him about her father's habit of walking every warehouse himself twice a year, because the accounts could not tell you what the work smelled like, and the work always smelled like something. "He sounds like someone I would have liked," the Duke said. "He was someone everyone liked," she said, including people he had just outperformed in a negotiation, which was the better achievement. He mentioned the toll-chart contract, signed the previous week, and the arrangement for Mrs. Fenny, settled through a cousin of his mother with property in Bath, who had agreed, with what Edmund described as moderate persuasion, to provide a permanent and comfortable situation. He reported it all as a man reporting the completion of work he had promised to complete, not expecting to be thanked. She thanked him. He received it directly. He was standing beside her now, not at the distance of the November water's edge, not across a table with a survey between them. Beside her, the way a person stands when they have stopped calculating the distance. "You said April," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the tributary. "The conditions are met," he said. "The channel will be complete in the last week of March. The toll-chart contract is signed. Mrs. Fenny is in Bath, and by her last letter, finding it considerably more agreeable than she had anticipated." He paused. "The conditions you named are met." "They are," she confirmed. "Then I am asking before April," he said. He turned to look at her, not with the managed certainty of Harrowfield in September, not with the recalculating expression of November, not with the careful honesty of the study in February, with nothing managed at all. because I find I am not interested in waiting for a calendar date, when the actual answer to the actual question is standing beside me at a river in March. He held her gaze with the full, undefended attention of a man who has stopped organizing the space between himself and the thing he wants. Elowen, will you marry me? Not a question in the conventional sense, no upward inflection, the statement of a man who had restructured an estate, renegotiated a contract, settled a 19-year obligation, and walked the length of a channel in March mud, and was now saying the thing all of it had been in service of, plainly, without performance. She looked at him beside the river, the willows beginning to green, the water running clear through the new intake form, the valley existing in its permanent, indifferent beauty. She considered the smile in the receiving room, not the social smile. She considered the Creswick deed, the mill, the study with its broken-spined books, the name she had said in February, and the way he had gone still. She considered what it meant to watch a man dismantle a policy he had held for 19 years in the Devonshire cold, without being asked and without announcing it. "Yes," she said. "I have been wanting to ask since November," he said, looking at her first. "Since the water's edge, since to begin with." "I know," she said. "I have been wanting to say yes since approximately the same moment. I needed you to earn it first. And have I?" She looked at the channel running clear for the first time in a decade, and at the man who had done the work without being asked and waited for her answer with the patience of someone who had learned, since November, how to wait. "You have," she said. "Entirely." He took her hand. She did not let go. Neither did he. The river moved. Behind them, at a tactful distance, Goss discovered something requiring his urgent attention at the far end of the survey markers, and would say nothing about what he had seen, with the impeccable discretion of a man who understood what discretion was actually for. The engagement was known by Saturday, faster than Elowen had expected, though she had underestimated neither the county's information network nor Mrs. Halvard Pine, who had known the channel site was the likely location of anything going to happen before April. Mrs. Pine called on Sunday with the energy of a woman whose restraint had reached its limit. She accepted tea before she had finished sitting down. "At the channel site," she said. "Not a question." "We were reviewing the intake modification." "Of course you were. He called on me yesterday. The quality of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying a long time and found his hands lighter. I have not seen that in him since before his mother left us." Elowen looked at the parlor window, the March garden beyond it, the willows along the tributary in the middle distance. "He told me about his mother," she said. "In the study. About Mrs. Fenny, and how the arrangement began." "He told you, Mrs.," Pine said, with the emphasis of a woman identifying something significant precisely because of how unusual it is. "Edmund Ashvane has not told anyone about that arrangement in 19 years, not to a single person who might have helped him think about it differently, until you walked out of his receiving room and said she may settle your debts. That was not kind," Elowen said. "In the moment. No, it was accurate, which is occasionally more useful." She looked at her steadily. "What did you expect when you went to Harrowfield?" "I expected to assess the situation and decide. I did not expect the first sentence to close every door I came prepared to open." "And what did you do?" "I opened a different door," she said, "on the other side of the valley." Mrs. Pine smiled, the real one, belonging to a woman of 55 who had navigated 20 years of Devonshire alone and found the navigation occasionally, genuinely, worth it. "You are going to be an extraordinary duchess." "I intend to be. I have already identified several things at Harrowfield that require reorganizing." "Have you told him?" "2 of them. He described them as preliminary observations. I described them as conclusions. We agreed to revisit the distinction after the engagement dinner. Mrs. Pine laughed, the full laugh of a woman who has been paying close attention to a situation for 5 months and is finding the resolution considerably better than she had dared to plan for. I will host the dinner. The last week of March. The full county. The good silver. She paused at the door. Lord Carwick will be invited. It is better to have him at the table, where he must behave, than outside it, where he will not. And the sight of Lord Carwick congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Ashvine will be one of the more satisfying things I have arranged in recent memory. I find I am not above that either, Elowen said. Mrs. Pine left. Elowen stood at the parlor window with her tea and looked at the valley, the tributary clear through the willows, the mill in the distance, the Harrowfield chimneys on the horizon. About November and 8 feet of water. About January and the mill, February and the study. March and a question asked, beside a river without a question mark. I came to this valley in anger, she thought. I am still here. Not contradictory conclusions, the same conclusion, arrived at from opposite directions. She put down her cup, went to the desk, and wrote to her father in Manchester. 1 draft. The engagement dinner at Holnacroft Hall was on the 28th of March, a Friday, which was Mrs. Halvard Pine's preference for occasions that mattered. 44 people. The full county assembled with the energy of a gathering that understood it was watching the closing act of a story it had been following since autumn, with the invested attention of people who had known something was going to happen and had not been certain what. Elowen arrived with her father, who had come down from Manchester on the Tuesday. He was a compact, deliberate man of 61, with his daughter's eyes and the manner of someone who had spent 40 years listening more than he spoke, and had therefore heard considerably more than most people in any given room. He had met the Duke on Wednesday, a meeting none of the 3 parties had arranged for Elowen to attend, which had lasted an hour and a half, and at the end of which both men emerged with the expressions of people who had said what needed saying and found the other party unexpectedly worth the conversation. Her father told her afterward, "He is direct." A pause. "He asked me 2 questions about the SAR firm before he asked anything about you, which told me he had done his reading. Then he asked about you, which told me the reading had a purpose. What did you tell him?" He looked at her with the attention he had given her since she was 12 years old and had never once looked away from. "I told him my daughter is the most precise person I have ever known, and that precision in her case is not a limitation. It is how she loves." She had said nothing to that. She had stood at the parlor window and turned over what it meant when a man who had known you your entire life named the thing you had never named yourself. She concluded he was right. She concluded she was going to be impractical about it for a few minutes in private, and then proceed. The dinner was everything a Devonshire dinner in late March was designed to be. Elowen was seated at Edmund's right, the most visible position in the room, and visibility was its own declaration. She wore the deep blue and her mother's earrings. Edmund arrived at the table and looked at her with the expression she now kept without apology. "Your father told me you once renegotiated a wool supplier's contract in 20 minutes during a dinner because you had the market figures memorized." 15 minutes, she said. "He tells it generously. He tells it with complete pride." He sat and looked at her over the candlelight. "Are you prepared for 44 people's opinions about this evening?" "I have been managing difficult rooms since I was 16, she said. "I am entirely prepared." "I know. I am asking for my own benefit." She looked at him, managing the table with the ease of a man who had done this since boyhood, and simultaneously not managing anything at all where she was concerned. "You will be fine. Better than fine." "I'm always fine," he said. "I'm occasionally uncertain whether fine is the correct standard." "It isn't," she said quietly. "And you are not currently fine. You are considerably beyond it. I have been watching." He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did. Lord Carwick was 4 seats down on the opposite side, included and required by every social convention to behave. He behaved. He said the right things, and at the end of the meal congratulated them both in the drawing room with the grace the occasion demanded and nothing beyond it. He met Eloan's eyes. She met his. Nothing further was required. Edmund beside her said nothing during it. He did not need to. His presence was the complete statement. Later, Mrs. Pine found Eloan in the entrance hall. He looked happy this evening, quietly, without announcement, but entirely present. I have not seen it in him in some time. She paused. "You are good for him." "He's good for me," Eloan said, "which is the thing I did not plan for." "What did you plan for?" "To be correct, to be proximate and competent and impossible to dismiss, to make him revise the assessment he had made before he ever met me." A pause. "I did not plan to find that the revised version was someone worth revising my own assessment for." Mrs. Pine was quiet for a moment. "What did you discover?" "That a man who names the problem honestly, even when the naming costs him, even when he does it badly the first time and has to come back and do it again with better materials, that man is worth considerably more than one who never names anything because he has never needed to. He was wrong about what he needed in September, but the instinct beneath the error, that he needed someone who would tell him the truth, that was entirely correct." Mrs. Pine took her hand for a moment, briefly, the gesture of a woman who has lived long enough to know that the best moments deserve to be witnessed. Then she released it, and the evening ended, and the county went home into the March night well satisfied, which was the correct conclusion to 14 years of Friday dinner hosting. They were married in April, in the church at Holnacroft, between the village and the river, a stone building of the 14th century, with a good east window and a floor worn smooth by 400 years of use. The valley was in its first real green, willows fully leaved, meadows clear, the river wide with the last of the melt and moving with the easy authority of water that knows exactly where it is going. Eloan wore the deep blue. Edmund had not been surprised. Her father had nodded when she told him. Orla had said, "Obviously." Mrs. Pine had said nothing, and had smiled the real smile when she saw her come through the church door. She walked in on her father's arm and looked at Edmund at the front of the church, and turned over the receiving room in September, the arranged chairs, 3 paragraphs, the word appropriate, and the smile that had not been a social smile. She had not known when she deployed it that it was the beginning of everything that followed. She had simply been accurate about the situation, and accuracy applied consistently had led her here, further than she had planned, and precisely where she intended to be. She turned over the versions of the smile. The first in the receiving room, intelligence where she expected an insult. The second at the water's edge in November, stillness while he said I did not answer it well. The third at the mill in January, controlled and unshown because the answer was too large for the occasion, and in March at the river, I know, which meant everything. She reached the front of the church. Edmund looked at her with the expression that had nothing of September in it, none of the receiving room certainty, none of the managed distance. Just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had bought the adjacent land, walked his failing mill, made him earn the question before she would answer it, and had become the person he was least able to imagine the valley without. She did not deploy the smile. It had served its purpose in September, and its purpose was complete. She took his hand. He held it with the same brief, certain grip he had used at the mill table and at the river's edge. And then, didn't let go. The ceremony proceeded with the gravity and warmth of an occasion that had earned both, and the east window sent its light across the worn stone floor, and the river moved beyond the church walls, and none of it required any management at all. Edmund found her in the east garden in the late afternoon, the April light coming in long and gold, and entirely without apology. She was examining the rose planting with the focused attention of a woman who had already made 3 decisions about it and was working on the 4th. "The climbers are on the wrong wall," she said, without turning. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression that was entirely his own, the one that had been building since their first meeting, and had arrived, in March at the river, at its full and undefended form. "The garden," he said, "is yours. The east wing and the dining room arrangement, and the library cataloging system, which I know has no defensible logic. All of it. In every sense, that matters. I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him, the man who had written 3 paragraphs in September and spent 7 months dismantling them and building something different in their place. She looked at the valley behind him, the mill in the distance, the tributary running clear in the April melt, both sides of the boundary now managed by people who had decided the thing on the other side of the water was worth the negotiation. She stepped toward him. He met her in the middle of the east garden, between the rose beds and the long April light. 2 estates on either side of a boundary they had settled in March and were now, in every sense, beyond. She smiled. The 4th smile, not the sharp intelligence of the receiving room, not the composed stillness of November, not the controlled restraint of January. The smile of a woman who has arrived precisely where she intended, by a route she had not entirely planned, and finds the destination worth every mile of the navigation. He understood it completely. She saw him understand it. "Elowen," he said. Her name in his voice had all of autumn, and the cold water, and the January mill, and the March river in it, and none of it was a policy or a condition or a prior claim anymore. It was simply her name, said by someone who had learned what it meant. "Edmund," she said. And this time it meant everything she had known since the water's edge that she would eventually say. He took her hand. She let him take it. The April evening continued around them, warm and entirely unhurried, and the valley went about its permanent business, and neither of them required it to be anything other than what it was. The best investments, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after you had made them than before. He had meant wool contracts and property deeds. She understood it now about something else entirely. She understood it completely.